In this lecture, we'll be considering the interconnections with food and health in both Alaska and Arizona. We'll start off by a general discussion of food and health. We'll look at Arizona first with a Tohono O'odham, and we'll look at some of the background information there, defining traditional foods, some of the factors which limit traditional foods, and promotion of traditional food security as a means to cope with type 2 diabetes as well as other diseases of affluence. We'll also look at work in Alaska, for the work of Philip Loring and myself, looking at economics of food access and food security and food assistance, with particularly considering Alaska Native peoples and health. So there are many different guidelines for healthy eating. We can see this from the USDA food pyramids, the Eat Well plate in the UK, and then some different types of food pyramids, weight pyramid, as well as Native American food pyramid. And of course, a lot of the issues here around food also are around the overall nutrition, and so the supplement industry is quite large as well. There's other sources of information, including texts that talk about various aspects of food, whether this is healing with food, particular types of foods due to the chemical activity within those foods, or a type of diet which would be changing along with seasons and eating for the body type and these sorts of things. So just some general information from the academic literature on food and health. I do a lot of work in the context of food security, and the idea of food security is that people have access at all times to sufficient, safe, nutritious, preferred, and culturally appropriate foods. And in this context, food is viewed as a right rather than something that's earned. We can see the implications of differential access to food in terms of structural violence in the context of Guatemala, where you see differences in growth between Mayan Guatemalans who were in Guatemala, and then when they move to the United States, you'll actually see them get larger in terms of having proper nutrition and being able to have access to foods. Now, in many instances, it's not just access to food in general, but to particular types of food. Anthony Winson talks about this in his Political Economy of Obesity, noting the greater concentration of pseudo-foods in low-income areas, or foods with high calorie contents and low nutritional value. Convini, for part there, looks at different perceptions of healthy eating along the lines of class. So whereas individuals in lower socioeconomic status would say, oh, my child is eating enough because they're very active, those in higher socioeconomic status would say things like, well, they're eating the rainbow, they're eating a wide variety of foods, they're eating a lot of fruit and veg. This one's the context of the UK here. Komlos, as well as Peroni and Price, note that shifts in diet coupled with more sedentary lifestyle has impacted nutrition and health outcomes. So we see this both in terms of calories expended versus in terms of energy and activities, as well as food intake. Gary Paul Nabhan, who did his dissertation work on the Tohono O'odham Nation, where I did my dissertation research, notes that traditional seeds are being conserved and utilized in order to promote health. In other words, growing of traditional crops, traditional varieties that had not been possible prior to, in some instances, prior to the formation of native seed search, which looked to redistribute these seeds in many different settings. Chen notes nutrition and food therapy are primary health care as well as a matter of social justice. Chaudhry et al. Note that food beliefs and practices should be utilized to shape health as well as nutritional outcomes. So you work from the basis of what people believe in order for nutritional interventions to be successful. And finally, Hassel notes from Woodland's Wisdom, Indigenous people are active themselves in creating nutritional education programs. So we'll start off here in Arizona and the Tohono O'odham Nation. The Tohono O'odham Nation is about the size of Connecticut. It is on the U.S.-Mexico border. There are 11 contiguous districts of the Tohono O'odham Nation, and you can see that the historic lands of the Tohono O'odham actually go into Mexico. Now, the Tohono O'odham Nation only exists in the United States, and this is where I did my dissertation field work. We were looking, and I was looking at the situation here and how agriculture had shifted over time. So from the 1910s, when this was first starting to get looked at, there was a lot in terms of floodwater farming. And the gradual shift occurred past the Great Depression. After World War II, in particular, you start to see massive decline in terms of floodwater farming. So that by 2002, there's less than 25 acres in floodwater farming. And what gets the bulk of this now in terms of agriculture is irrigation, groundwater farming. Now, a lot of these farms that were set up by the U.S. government, and the intent here was to bring the Tohono into the global, or into the U.S. economy in terms of export types of products. So traditional food groups have emerged in the Tohono Nation. As Lewis notes, this is a response to marginalization of historic food production systems. So we see these shifts occur in a variety of contexts that I just talked about. The traditional food groups include the Saint-Nazaire Cooperative Farm, which is in the Saint-Nazaire district, right outside the Mission Church. And this is a site where the Central Arizona Project water actually gets delivered. It's the final terminus of that. Tohono Community Action, which has probably been the most active organization on the Tohono Nation in terms of promoting tradition and traditional foods. Specifically, the Healthy O'odham Promotion Program, really targeting exercise. The Tohono Community College doing a lot in terms of agriculture and looking at local food production, as well as Tohono language revitalization. And then Native Seed Search, started by Gary Paul Nabhan, and others, looking to grow out native seeds. They have a farm out in Patagonia as well as in Tucson. They have a facility there which looks into the Four Corners region of the United States, as well as into Mexico to Sonora. So my data collection for this research, first gaining permission and approval from the 11 districts. I was ultimately able to do research in a few of these districts. The recruitment, I engaged in participant observation in a number of different contexts. At the time, I was working as a licensed massage therapist and massage therapy instructor at an allied health college in Tucson, and basically went out with groups of students, and we performed chair massage at a number of events for Healthy O'odham Promotion Program, and did some other types of activities with them as well. From that, I was able to build a little base and reach out and work with the community a little bit more. I also worked as a traditional foods vendor for just a little bit, and then volunteered a few times on a couple farms on the Tohono Nation, as well as worked for Native Seed Search to start off the dissertation research. In addition to participant observation and archival work, I also looked at and interviewed 55 individuals. 48 of these were Tohono during the time that I was actively conducting field research. And so one of the things that really came out early on was how people thought about traditional foods. And a lot of the discussion here is this idea of pre-contact food. So the animals that were hunted, they were gathered, so the foraging in the desert, as well as agricultural production, so the corn, beans, and squash, and a lot of these things, the cacti, the mesquite, and other food there, then the various animals that were hunted for. Now when Spanish came in, they introduced a number of different crops and products, and you can see this on the article. That's a assigned reading for the week. And then particularly when the United States came in, the commodity foods, flour, lard, sugar, these types of things come in and they get introduced in the Tohono Nation. And many today would point to particularly these types of introductions and the associations with type 2 diabetes. And so Ernie, in talking about traditional food, says, well, and he's sort of negotiating here in what actually constitutes a traditional food. Well, I guess in a way it is kind of traditional, but it's not really native food. It's kind of fry bread, maybe, but tortillas is more like Mexican, but you do have to work at it. But yeah, I mean, I like it a lot. I guess I would consider it traditional, or like I said, maybe a little more Mexican than what I would consider to be Native American. So here, Ernie's going back and forth and saying, yeah, fry bread is traditional, even though it's coming from the United States. So there's this perception here that this is a traditional food for the O'odham. Lionel from Chukuk, and I should note that these are all pseudonyms. These aren't their actual names. He notes that, no one ever sat me down and said, okay, this is a traditional food, this is a Mexican food. So whenever the Spanish came and started teaching or introducing us, they brought the cattle and the horses. But who knows how we ate at the time when we were fighting the Apaches? What did we eat at the time before there were treaties? Sarah, in defining traditional foods from Guachi, middle-aged female, says, the more traditional meat that I think of is the deer. The rabbits that they had to cook up there, hunt down and cook. Doves, I think of more traditional. I don't know why I think a cow isn't to me. I think that maybe a cow wasn't around a long time. It was just recently introduced to the nation, and then the Indian health saying you shouldn't eat range meat. So here you have issues of environmental contamination with range cattle. You also have, of course, the introduction here of the Spanish bringing in cattle into the area, so more recently introduced foods. Now, for young adults versus elders in particular, there's differences in traditional foods. We'll just take a quick look at this chart here. And the young adult minus elder is the percentage here difference between the two of these. Young adults were those ranged ages 20 to 39. Elders were 60 and above. So what this indicates here is that the young adults, those 20 and 39, were much more likely to mention things like fry bread or popovers, potato salad, tortillas, red chili, and squash and cheese as traditional foods. On the other side of the spectrum, you have elders, those 60 and above, who are much more likely to mention cholla buds, prickly pear, bayadach or saguaro, temporary beans, mesquite, and corn as the traditional foods. So these are areas where there's a fair amount of divergence between young adults as well as elders. The traditional foods, the reason why the people are saying they were consumed, the number one reason was to maintain health and then keep tradition. Food is healthier. So all of these things here at the top, and then also prevent diabetes, live longer. So spiritual aspects as well. There are, for the vast majority of those with whom I spoke, this idea of health was intimately tied in with traditional foods. And a lot had to do with the impact of type 2 diabetes. So Susan specifically discussing health. I know one of my grandpas used to say that anything that came from the earth was the most nutritious and the most healthy. And so that is considered the traditional foods because we sowed it, we reaped it, we harvest it, and all of that. He says it makes you whole in that way. So I think a lot about that when I think about these foods. Larry, when discussing health, says, we're eating some of the old foods. We cook them. I cook them. I should have paid more attention when my mom was alive. You know, it's a learning process. I ask questions. My dad still remembers. He used to be a pretty good cook and lets me cook now. I try to get back to some of the foods, like I said, having meat and bread, those kinds, but I don't eat as much bread as I used to because I want to live longer. I have grandchildren, diabetes. I know where it can lead. My biggest fear is to be on dialysis. You know, I've seen a lot of suffering with dialysis. Rosa discussing health. For ours, it is healthy. It grows out in the wild, and that's how I grew up eating traditional foods. I wish we were back then because we hardly had any meat and stuff, and they say red meat isn't that good. When we're living on vegetables, we were always healthy, never sick, but now they have too much junk food. The supermarket foods, taste different. They are not as good as the ones that you grow or get. So the Tohono O'odham food system in terms of growing or getting is done today through a number of different organizations, Tohono O'odham Community Action, Santa Vera Cooperative Farm, as well as families engaged in hunting and smaller garden type of activities. The production, again, TOCA, Santa Vera Cooperative Farm, the gardens, and an off-reservation as well, particularly with Native Seed Search growing temporary beans and marketing these broadly. In terms of availability of the foods, because we're talking about a food security issue here, a lot of individuals will access this through purchase. So you see sales through Tohono O'odham Community Action, through Santa Vera Cooperative Farm. Santa Vera Cooperative Farm's materials are over here. You can see it's just very generic, very plain, so marketed mostly for folks on the nation. And then over here, this is Tohono O'odham Community Action, and whereas this product could sell in the nation, it's also potentially for outsiders because there's a lot of description on here, including information, nutritional information that's required to be able to sell these products off the reservation as well. So the off-reservation sales would take place with Native Seed Search, grocery stores, internet, and other locations as well. There's been much work on promoting traditional foods, so participation in subsistence, cookbooks, different classes from Tohono O'odham Community College to K through 12 education, fitness and food initiatives, as well as the Desert Rain Cafe right outside of Sells, Arizona, the nation's capital, which grows, which sells traditional foods which are made, which people can just go in and get lunch there. In the second part of the lecture, I will specifically talk about the experiences in Alaska and the work with Phil Loring and students at the University of Alaska Fairbanks.